Hi there, I'm Stan Baker, one of the hosts of Circle Forum, along with Shelley Steele and Steve Young. In this episode, we speak with Chris Hicks, a principal and the chair of the Council of School Leaders, the COSL, of the Manitoba Teachers Society. Chris discusses how principals face increasing demands, such as enforcing new cell phone bans and managing nutrition programs, which extend far beyond their core educational leadership duties.
This podcast is brought to you by the changing educational system in North America, in which schools increasingly act as community centers, offering services beyond education, such as food programs, mental health support, and even healthcare. For example, in the U.S., 1 in 5 schools now has a health clinic on site, and Canada has expanded programs like universal nutrition in many provinces. This shift places additional responsibilities on principals and teachers, blurring the lines between educators and social workers. This is a long way from what most teachers and principals were trained to teach in schools.
Check out our website, www.restorative.ca, for ways to use restorative leadership to navigate those complex challenges you face daily as a school principal. Shelley's away, so let's join your hosts, Steve and me, Stan. What are some of the things that you're hearing around the province?
Everyone in the country is dealing with. Workload is getting almost untenable at times. 2 things over the summer were brought into Manitoba that fall squarely on the desk of principals and vice principals. One was this: we banned smartphones from kindergarten to grade 8. So they're not even allowed in the building. But the good thing there is that probably most schools, especially if you had kindergarten to grade 8, they were doing something like that anyway. So the rollout was pretty simple, but there's still things to consider. And some of them are like almost pragmatic things, like what happens if you have to take a kid's cell phone away and you drop it, or if it gets lost, or that kind of thing. Who's responsible? The other one was a universal nutrition policy. There was an announcement, I don't know when it was, probably back in the spring, about funding for school nutrition plans, which great. Again, the schools that had been doing something like that anyway, but it's still another organizational that has very little to do with the actual core responsibility of a school, which is teach kids how to read and manipulate numbers and understand history. We're walking away from that. And it takes a lot of energy and time to deal with a food program, especially if you're a school that doesn't have any kind of certifiable preparation area. And then of course you have to staff it. There's POs, there's all kinds of work to be done.
Hi there, it's Paula, an AI voice. Stan puts words in my mouth. Chris is about to describe a third area of growing concern for principals. Chris?
And we poll our members, a random group of members every year. And, for 25 years, what would be the number one thing that's concerning for classroom teachers? It's almost always classroom management or behavioral things, right? Now we're just bypassing that completely and going straight to violence. This has come up to be a major issue for our people, is violent students, and not just violent toward each other, but violent towards the adults.
What's the impact then of this increased concern and focus on violence and violence prevention on the principal in his or her role?
People take a leave of absence. They go on leave. So now when that happens, again, what's the first thing you need to do? You need to replace the person. And then there's nobody to replace it. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
The other thing it does is it almost discourages school administrators to not even report it. Because then it gives the school a certain reputation or perspective or perception in public or whatever. And at the same time, when we're trying to recruit and retain teachers and make this as attractive a profession as possible, the last thing you want to do is say, oh yeah, violence is the number one thing the classroom teachers and staff are dealing with right now. So it's causing a lot of stress. It's causing a lot of stress for people, and principals, I think, are caught between, you need to defend your teacher. That should be the default. But at the same time, you have to uphold what you're being told from a different branch of the institution, and you're left there looking like you're not doing anything. And if you don't defend your teacher, then you're throwing them under the bus.
What do you counsel principals to do in situations where they're facing that kind of pull between two responses?
I say side with, honestly, if it's an act of violence, you side with the person who's been violated, right? I would, if it's an act of violence, absolutely remove. I would, if it's just that, if that's all it is, and there's really no other nuance around it, I would say until you can figure out a plan, that the child has to be in a different environment.
And Paula here again. The conversation shifts a bit now to considering suspensions and expulsions. Steve, you were saying?
I was thinking back, Chris, a while ago, in the heyday of suspensions, and you made the point that no one's ever going to blame you if you send a kid home so you can put a plan in place. When I go back in my history of being an administrator back in the early 2000s and whatnot, we would suspend kids left and center, but we didn't think about putting a plan in place. They were just gone and then they came back. And that's, I think, the difference between, even when I retired in 2018, I still did the odd suspension now and again because the rules said I had to, but it was always about, okay, let's get the parents in, let's figure out a plan, let's put some supports in place to bring this kid back, which was totally different than when I first started out.
The conversation is wide-ranging, and we end up talking about what's happening with retirements of principals and with the recruitment of new principals. Over to you, Chris.
The next thing we want to look at, like during the pandemic, or during the restrictions, so 2021, 21, 22, we were keeping an eye on like whether or not lots of our members were leaving, not leaving education, but leaving admin. So we looked at our retirement numbers, because if people change their job description, their salary usually changes, but we didn't notice any flight really from administration during that time. So it felt like they were holding it together. But now that 2 years have gone by since the mask mandate was lifted, we're noticing a lot more vocal, like people are starting to talk a lot more about, as soon as I'm able to, I'm pulling the chute, I'm heading out. At the same time, we have field-led courses. Tracy probably talked about those. She's leading them right now. Virtual learning series for school leaders or aspiring school leaders, and they're full. So that kind of indicates that there's still lots of interest in going into school, into principalships or vice principals, school leadership positions too. Mm-hmm. So I think it's probably just, when we talk about the pre-COVID and the post-COVID, what were the salient features on your list? In 2019, 2018, 2017, 16, 15, 14, the number one thing on my list was child and adolescent mental health and lack of subs, like an ideological one and a pragmatic one. And post-COVID, what are the number one things on my list? Child and adolescent mental health and a lack of substitute teachers. Mm-hmm. Right.
What kinds of things would you like to see in place for those principals who are thinking of retiring because of the stress, and for those who are coming into the role as new aspiring principals?
What I tell any aspiring principal, or even one who's new to the profession, and vice principal, is there somebody on your staff you can confide in? Or is there someone in your school division you can confide in? Because it can be a really lonely job. Is there someone you can bounce ideas off of? Are you able to create a kind of admin team that's made up of the principal? If you're lucky enough to have a vice principal, the vice principal. You have a guidance counselor, a resource teacher, right? Maybe in bigger schools, a department head. Is there some kind of leadership team you can put together? And the things you can't talk about with everybody, but just at a certain point, decisions have to be made, and ultimately there are ones that the principal or the principal designate has to make. They're just much better decisions if there's more and more input, right? If you can somehow create an environment that is most often a collaborative leadership structure, not always, but most often, so that there's a way to keep you focused, keep other people focused, and just divvy out some certain duties and responsibilities that typically ended up going on the principal's plate. Obviously, lots of those have to be. So that's what I would say for aspiring leaders. You don't have to do everything by yourself all the time. That would be one. And for retiring principals, I would say that there's not, it's certainly stress, but I think if you've been a principal for a long time, I would say, are you still managing to look at your day and see the things you don't have to do versus the things you do have to do? Like, what's a more sensible way to plan your day?
Steve and Stan spend a bit of time now talking about a restorative practices training that Steve and Shelley completed recently that was geared specifically for principals. Stan picks it up here. Stan?
Steve and our colleague Shelley had a chance to work with a group of principals. But what I wanted you to just maybe talk a little bit about, Steve, is what kinds of changes did you notice that the principals went from and to in terms of that whole feeling of team or being part of a team?
The very first thing that they mentioned is because we went up there, we did it in person. Principals there were quite thrilled that they all got together and they're in one room for 2 whole days. They could actually be in a room for 2 whole days. But the value in that and helping to build team was great because you could actually work with the person sitting right next to you. You could talk to them, have those little aside conversations that you can't do very well. You can't do it at all, almost at all on a Zoom meeting. And so I think just the in-person piece is important. Now, once a month, we meet with them again and do online coaching. So I would say, if nothing else, let's try and get back to in-person as much as possibly can. We did 2 days of restorative practices training. We did a day of framework training, which is a general understanding of what is restorative. What does it mean to be restorative? And then a day of the circle process of how to actually use the processes with staff, and then have that flow down from staff to staff using that processes in their classroom with students. How can we lead in a restorative manner? What are some of the things a principal can do on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis in working with staff, students, parents, community? When you're a principal or an administrator, how do you work with the people that you have responsibility for in a manner that helps to build a positive working environment, if you will, so that when the problems do happen, and they will, just pick a day, something's going to come down the pipe, we can now approach those people and work with those people that we have a positive relationship with already and say, okay, we've got this problem, let's work it out now. Not there's a problem and I'm the principal and I'm going to fix it because I can't.
A couple of things that I observed following from those workshops. One was there were principal and vice principal that were basically reporting back on what this had done, and they were dealing with a grade 5 girls situation of about 7 or 8 girls. You know what I'm talking about, right?
You know the deal.
Oh my goodness, and they can go on and on.
When I started my career, it was grade 7 and 8 girls.
Oh
yes.
My goodness. So they were talking about actually dealing with a mean girls situation in grade 5, and they took a different way of approaching it, using a circle and using restorative questions. So there was a structure, there was a bit of a formula, if you will, that we trained them on. The girls loved it so much that they said, even after they had resolved what was going on, can we talk like this again tomorrow?
As we wrap up our conversation, Chris talks a bit more about things he tells principals to consider. You're on again, Chris.
What I would explain to administrators is your office, that should be the hardest thing to convince yourself to do in a daily, is to get into your office, not get out of your office. Right? You should convince yourself that it's almost nearly impossible to get into your office rather than the other way around.
Principal balancing act that Chris Hicks references is having an impact on principal retirements and recruitments. Organizations like the Council of School Leaders in Manitoba can support those principals nearing burnout and help aspiring leaders navigate the complexities of the role, and those are critical focal points for their work. Find out more about our work with restorative leadership that really does address how to distribute the leadership in your school building through restorative practices at www.restorative.ca. And let's be intentional with our questions to principals about critical issues in principling like burnout and retention.